Thanks everybody for coming to the probably the most audaciously titled presentation that I've ever given, How to Save Democracy. I don't think that that's something that we can really accomplish over the next 30, 40, however many minutes, but we're going to try to get into some of the basics around it and hopefully come at it from some different perspectives than maybe we're used to in this conversation. So democracy itself, just as a term, it shouldn't cause confusion, but it does. You have right-wing media trolls that sometimes point out the United States is actually a republic. It's not a democracy, right? We hear that. They ignore that James Madison himself defined a republic back in the Federalist as a government based on representation, and that no one who uses the term democracy today, right? They don't mean a direct democracy like ancient Athens, or they don't mean a New England town meeting. It means a representative democracy, okay? I've had students that want to go down this road, so just right off the bat, I wanted to get there with a definition of democracy, okay? And you think about, when you think about democracy, you primarily think about voting and elections. We talk about this in our Indivisible meetings, right? We focus on voting and elections. Think back to countries that are in transition from dictatorships to democracy. They are celebrated when they have those first elections, right? Think back to Iraq. You had individuals with ink on their fingers, right? Showing off the first time that they voted. But in many countries around the world, elections aren't competitive. They aren't free. They aren't fair. They ratify the power of authoritarian leaders. So this conversation that we're having today is not just about democracy. I want to be very clear, all right? Think about North Korea. Its official name is the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, but its leader, Kim Jong-un, was elected with 100% of the vote, all right? Not even Donald Trump's supporters are audacious enough to say that he would receive 100% of the vote in any given county, right? So no one thinks of North Korea as a democracy. But in recent years, when scholars have questioned whether democracy might be in moments of crisis all over the world, they look beyond elections. And so I think we also have to, right? But they're not looking beyond it by much. A couple of examples here, one that I've brought up many times in our conversations. There's an article by these first two authors here, Huck and Ginsburg, titled How to Lose a Constitutional Democracy. And they describe three features of constitutional democracy as competitive elections, free speech, and the legal rules necessary to ensure democratic choices. In one of my favorite books from the last 5 years, although it's a terrifying read, How Democracies Die. You're probably sick of me bringing it up. It's fantastic. It's by two political scientists, Levitsky and Ziblatt. It focuses on the erosion of norms, right? Including those associated with electoral democracy. I listed some of them here. Leaders that have a weak commitment to institutions, denial of legitimacy of opponents, toleration of violence. These should sound somewhat familiar and terrifying to us, right, as Americans. And this is a little bit of a problem, obviously, because this emphasis in recent years has been on norms and institutions, okay? And there is this restoring norms approach. Thank you, Matt, for the laugh there. This restoring norms approach cannot fully explain what makes democracy work. And the reform agenda that we end up putting forward does not make democracy more inclusive, just in its nature. And this is a problem because the most sustainable way to preserve norms and to preserve institutions is to make democracy more inclusive. Socially, economically, politically. Consider the conditions under which leaders do adhere to these different norms, right? Norms are just informal practices that a group of people follow that even though they would benefit from breaking them, okay? We can include in this category informal courtesies that people grant each other, civility on the Senate floor. Thankfully, we don't beat each other up on the Senate floor, cane each other, and respect for institutions, not attacking the freedom of the press or integrity of the judiciary. So the puzzle here is figuring out, why do political leaders, why would they ever restrain themselves? by following informal rules, these informal conventions. And the first explanation is that they actually have this long-term interest in adhering to these norms. If our political leaders are repeat players, they are going to be participating in politics for a long time. And if you look at the leadership in the Democratic and Republican parties, these people intend to stay in power for a long, long time, right? They might be better off in the long run by keeping the norms intact, even if breaking the norm might be in their best short-term interest. In the first 2 years of the Trump administration, Senate Republicans would have benefited from ending the filibuster for all legislation, so they could pass whatever they wanted on a majority vote, but they didn't. In a time of Republican control in the House of Representatives, the Senate, and the presidency, they were the ones with the trifecta. Ending the filibuster would have allowed them to advance their agenda successfully, but they anticipated, rightly, that Democrats would one day have control over the Congress and the presidency like they do now. And in that situation, they'd be better off if they didn't have that power. Perhaps, Matt, we can send this part of the presentation directly to Joe Manchin, Kirsten Sinema. But these are what we call infinite games, right? Both sides agree that you're going to be playing the game of politics forever. So there's a second explanation why norms hold, and that's those who adhere to them are part of a shared cultural community with many personal ties and common beliefs, okay? An example of this would be like the diamond industry. They don't rely on courts, they don't rely on governments to enforce contracts or to police their boundaries of sales, and they haven't done that for centuries because they rely on personal relationship and trust to enforce their contracts. But this only works because it's dominated by this ethically homogenous group of merchants who have intergenerational family businesses, okay? So set that to the side for a second. For both of those explanations, norms are anti-democratic. They are anti-democratic. If you're talking about reciprocity, the first one, they're stronger if senators are entrenched in power for decades because they know they will eventually be on the losing end when that norm breaks, okay? If we're talking about diamond dealers, the community is small, it's insular. You have, in other words, clubby environments. We're all in the same club, and they're better at preserving norms. So if you rely on this basic insight, you end up having some commentators that say the problem today is we actually have too much democracy. Too much democracy. Andrew Sullivan, some of you might be familiar with his writing. He wrote in New York Magazine, he had an article titled "Democracies End When They Are Too Democratic." Despite the fact this was an infuriating article, there are many people in this camp that hold that populism of this era proves that elites are central to safeguarding liberty. But for the people who are not willing to adopt some sort of aristocracy, a commitment to norms and democracy ends up being in tension. Okay, so there's one other situation in which these norms hold that doesn't rely on these elites. And it's when the population, when we as a people believe strongly in whatever that norm is, right? And when that's the case, leaders are far less likely to actually attack it. The leaders who violate those norms end up facing the fury of public opinion. They get sanctioned at the ballot box. They get all sorts of blowback. So under that theory, the real strength of norms and institutions, which we have been told repeatedly are crumbling around us, it doesn't come from leaders or elites, but it comes from us. It comes from society at large. So with those explanations in mind to set up this larger conversation, how should we understand the current attacks on our democracy, our norms, our institutions, everything? And there are really two key explanations for this. The first, democracy has broken the elite club, all right? And the political movements that stormed the gates, I'm not talking literally, I'm not talking January 6th, but the political movements that elected new leadership, those new leaders are less committed to norms and institutions. And some of them want to destroy them, right? We let them through the gates and we have elected people who want to destroy the system that we have. The repeat player and the common culture explanations that I talked about, for norms have failed because our leaders are no longer in that small homogenous group who will serve in office together over decades. So it's no surprise that the most prominent norm breaker of the modern era, Donald Trump, he never held elected office. He was never appointed to any kind of office. And there are outsiders who are the ones most intent on eliminating longstanding laws, practices, institutions, right? We saw this time and again throughout the Trump administration. That's one. The second possible reason that norms come under assault is that elites remain in power, but they are responding to the popular preferences of the people in order to stay in power. This is a case where politicians fear a primary challenger, or they worry about losing turnout from their political base, and they might stay silent or even participate in an attack on norms if they think their constituents demand it. That should probably sound pretty familiar to anyone who has paid attention to recent comments of officials saying they don't support a January 6th commission. They do support the big lie and other things like that. So no matter which one you accept here, whether the people broken into the elite club or the club members are just responding to the demands of the people themselves, norms are violated, institutions are attacked, because the people are no longer invested enough in them to preserve what we have. And the deep problem, the difficult problem here is not the erosion of our institutions or the breaking of norms, but the fact that we don't have sufficient respect for those norms and institutions. And therefore, the crisis of democratic government is really a crisis of democratic society. And that leads to a critical point. In order to have a functioning democratic government, we have to fulfill the conditions for a democratic society. You know, conversations about democracy emphasize the expansion of the franchise, the right of individuals to participate in the political process. And this is what we are all about, right? We are about holding elected officials accountable and getting more people to vote. And those are essential. If you look back through our history, you know, that's the story that we tell ourselves. It was the heroic tale of how the Jacksonians expanded the franchise to white men. They abolished property requirements for voting. Then we had the Civil War and Reconstruction that ended slavery and gave African Americans the right to vote. There were suffragettes that fought and won the battle for women voting. And the Civil Rights Movement made civil and political equality real throughout the country. So we kept expanding and expanding the franchise, arguably much too slowly, actually inarguably. But democracy was secure as long as these basic institutions were in place, right? America has been called the world's oldest democracy. I was listening to a podcast maybe a week or two ago, and they said, actually, America's not. We've only had anything close to actual democracy since the 1960s, maybe, if that, right? But the neoliberal era's vision of democracy, what it did was it divorced politics from economics and society, and it overemphasized individual rights, okay? And the crisis of democracy theorists in these last few years, I'm talking about how I'm looking at the books on my desk. Astor Taylor, Democracy May Not Exist, but We'll Miss It When It's Gone. We Are Indivisible. Great book. You should buy it. How Democracies Die, right? All these things that are telling us what is wrong with our democracy and how to fix it, right? They have largely focused on these features or the institutions and norms that are necessary to sustain the existing system, right? To build back what is crumbling. And the problem here is it's only attacking one, or it's actually only capturing one aspect of democracy, the political aspect. And it's a pretty narrow vision of it entirely. Political democracy is so critically important. But for a government to be democratic, lower D democratic, in any meaningful, and underline this word, sustainable sense, it has to have more than elections, and it has to have more than the associated legal institutions that we have relied upon. You cannot separate politics from economic, social, and ethical commitments of the society. Taking that all in, that's all building up to this, okay? Take a broader view of democracy. It is far more demanding, even though it has always been what democracy has required to flourish. I'll say that again. If we take this broader view of democracy, it's more demanding than what we are asking of our elected officials right now. But it's what is required to have democracy. The first thing, and I'm sorry, I don't have flashy slides here, so you're just gonna have to mostly listen to me. Democracy requires a measure of social solidarity, okay? Citizens who have an ethical commitment to the larger democratic community, okay? Neoliberalism's individualism, the desire, in other words, to privatize everything, that is in direct conflict with democracy's demand for social solidarity. If you have a government that's founded on the rule by the people, it requires the people to be a part of that project, right? John Dewey once wrote that democracy is the idea of a community life itself. And a community, by definition, requires some kind of common culture. Politics is always going to feature minor divisions, okay, on a variety of issues, on just about every issue you could imagine. But when democratic societies become severely polarized, all right, another theme of our conversations over the years, if you polarize into rich and poor and north and south and free and slave and red and blue, everything becomes a zero-sum game. And when you have those situations, the democratic community is no longer engaged in the project of self-government, but they are engaged in warfare by any other means, okay? So institutions that once facilitated social understanding, think about the things that we share, public schools, public parks, services, the military, they are increasingly segregated by class and race and other things. The media environment, and Matt went into this expertly in his presentation, which only featured a few TV channels and therefore kind of united everyone at a time in a common news, a common culture, common foundational understanding of facts, right? That's obviously no longer the case. It is fractured. There are fewer gatekeepers. There's increasing personalization. The algorithm feeds you what you want, right? And you have commentators on the left and the right, not to be both sides about this, but they're increasingly segregated, again, by race, class, culture. And what happens in these societies that are deeply divided, they get ripped apart by these centrifugal forces scapegoating, quote unquote, other people for the problems that happen in society. And democracy has a really difficult time withstanding these incredibly violent clashes of opinion. James Kloppenberg, intellectual historian, observed, democracy is an ethical ideal, all right? To participate in a democracy, in a democratic community, it means inherently rejecting the selfish individualism that neoliberalism promotes, okay? So we are starting here, we are ripping this thing down to the gears, okay? Democratic citizens have to see that true freedom, that true democracy is connected inherently to the flourishing of a larger community. And importantly, paradoxically, that involves certain amounts of restraint and certain amounts of sacrifice. And I think that's something that a lot of people don't want to hear, but it does. That is a requirement for democracy. Democracy does not mean whatever I want, whenever I want. It just doesn't. The second precondition here is economic democracy. And for most of the history of Western political thought, from Aristotle onward, okay, philosophers and political leaders recognized democracy cannot survive when there is extreme economic inequality. It requires a strong, thriving, large middle class. And when you have a society in which wealth is concentrated in the hands of the few, you're going to have one of two disastrous fates, okay? You're either going to descend into oligarchy, hi Vladimir, and the rich use their wealth to rig the political system in their favor, or the divide between the rich and everyone else will lead to popular backlash with a demagogue leading the revolt. So when you have these economically unequal societies, they are inherently unstable. And one way or another, they become anti-democratic, undemocratic. When you have a society with a substantial middle class, people have largely shared economic interests. And political conflicts as a result become less likely to lead to polarization or to fundamentally destabilize the republic, all right? And if you have an economic democracy, it ensures that no private actors, all right, individuals or corporations, this is wild, I know, that no private actors have so much power that they can easily dominate individuals or the government. Teddy Roosevelt once wrote, "There can be no real political democracy unless there is something approaching an economic democracy." So political democracy, all right, the third one here, is what we normally think of as democracy. That's what we spend most of our time discussing, rightly so. And it might seem obvious to say that a representative democracy needs to be representative of all the people. But even amid serious worries about the erosion of democracy, our political reforms largely end up falling far short of this basic principle. And I'm not speaking out against any specific legislation here, and there's a lot of good ways that we can chip away at this. But reformers long focus on really great things like ending gerrymandering, ending voter suppression, other election rules that undermine the ability of everyone to have an equal voice in government, right? This is, in a lot of ways, the fight that we are engaged in right now, and it must be won. But over the last decade or so, political scientists have shown that policy outcomes in government consistently represent wealthy people and corporate interests, and they don't represent ordinary people well. And part of that reason is that wealthy people vote at higher rates, they donate more, they contact their representatives more, they serve as elected officials far more. But the challenge goes farther than elections. Every single branch of government is susceptible to influence. Congress is made up of people drawn from the wealthiest subsets of our population. It's beset by lobbyists who educate, in quotation marks, members and their staffs. They sometimes directly draft legislation for members. We've seen this in the voter suppression cases around the country. If you go to the executive branch, you have corporate interest groups. They wield considerable power over the regulatory process. Even the courts, judicial appointees frequently come from backgrounds that defend corporations. You have very, very few who've spent their careers as public defenders or representing workers or representing consumers. That seems like a small problem. So there's this robust debate that we're having now. How do we balance majority rule with protecting the rights of minorities, right? A system that has majority rule is hardly democratic, and a system that channels the views of the wealthy is hardly representative. That is more like an oligarchy or an aristocracy. And if you have these conditions of economic inequality, stagnation, scarcity, people become more susceptible to claims that other groups are to blame for the failures of public policy or for the structural changes in the economy. You know, we hear all the time about political tribalism. This is exactly what that is talking about, okay? Economic inequality and political inequality, which we don't talk enough about, they go together, they go hand in hand. The wealthiest people and interest groups use their wealth to reshape laws, to reshape regulations in ways that benefit themselves. And that in turn further deepens economic inequality. So let's flip that on its head. If you have a society in which there is relative economic equality, neither the relatively wealthy nor the relatively poor is going to be able to skew public policy, because the middle class is going to pursue policies that help the most people. If you have greater political equality, that in turn leads to greater economic equality. Because if you're in the majority, your preferences are more likely to be put into law. And the majority of people in that case are going to be unlikely to support policies that disproportionately help the wealthy. Okay, finally, for this section. A society that has these deep social divisions that I was talking about, it is going to break down politically. Each tribe interprets all policy issues as part of a winner-take-all system, and that leaves compromise and cooperation virtually impossible. So in contrast, if you have a relatively homogeneous society, you have disagreements among people, they're relatively minor, it renders political compromise possible. But there's one political theorist who notes, I like this quote, societies thrive on trust, but they need the widest possible radius of trust to do well, end quote. Think about how that applies to our society, how far away we are from that at this particular moment. Social solidarity expands trust among people within the community, and it facilitates political cooperation rather than conflict. And if you have a breakdown in any of these political, economic, social conditions for democracy, it can lead to breakdown in all three, but success in one begets success in the others. When people are economically equal, their political power ends up being relatively equal, which leads to more responsive policy choices, okay? And part of the problem today is that we have ignored these preconditions, the things that we actually need for a redefined democracy, a more true democracy. We've ignored it for a long, long time, okay? Go back to the 1960s. The United States finally decided the political community would treat most of our citizens as equal, black and white, men and women. But at the very moment in which our society was becoming more politically inclusive, it failed to become more economically equal, and it failed to become more socially united. There was a rising tide that was lifting, not all, but most boats post-World War II. And that started to recede by the time you got to the 1970s. There was this brutally competitive global economy. You had neoliberal policies that led to a generation or several generations now of wage stagnation. You had economic collapse of communities across the country. I live in one of those communities. You know, rather than getting closer to economic democracy, what neoliberalism of this era did was it ended up bringing us closer to oligarchy. The civil rights movements of the 60s promised to replace segregation with integration, but there were efforts to achieve social solidarity across race, gender, and geography. We failed. And neoliberalism championed retreating into these private cliques to emphasizing our individual rights instead of confronting the hard work. I don't mean to understate how hard this is, the hard work of building a national community and fighting for these preconditions of a democracy. You know, attempts at racial integration led to white flight from cities and eventually to informal segregation of different neighborhoods. Dog whistle politics, right? Before and after Nixon and Reagan, right? Let alone the Trump era. Dog whistle politics keeps resentment simmering always. And the culture wars bring more and more division. But it is possible. I promise you, this is not just defining the problem and telling you how we can redefine democracy. We're getting to solutions, okay? Where past generations have failed, we can fulfill the aspiration of a redefined democracy, okay? How, you may ask? Let's get into that. It's not going to be easy. Legislation doesn't pass on its own. And if you have a bold and transformative agenda, it's really hard to accomplish. But we live in an era of political and constitutional hardball. And for the most part, I think I might be preaching to the choir on this one, only one team has been playing. Scholars who write about constitutional hardball They mean that the leaders approach political tactics and negotiations with the understanding that the stakes are so high, the consequences of losing are so great, that the leaders have to take drastic and controversial actions. But we can understand political hardball in a broader sense. Political leaders need to negotiate hard and push the boundaries, substantively and tactically. The Republicans understand that this is a winner-take-all moment, and that whoever wins will set the terms for a generation or more. Mitch McConnell, if you think back, he announced he would not approve any Supreme Court nominee after Justice Scalia died until after the 2016 election, so they could preserve a majority in the Supreme Court. And then when Republicans in Wisconsin and Michigan, they lost statewide elections in 2018, what did they do? They did not go quietly into the night. They did not go quietly into the minority. What did they do? They played power politics. They sought to strip new Democratic governors and statewide officials of the traditional power in those offices. Those are not normal events. Those are extraordinary events. A political minority frustrating the will of people in an election, all to retain power. And you have many centrists that worry about this. You have some liberals that worry about this. You have some moderate conservatives that worry about tactics like this. And they also worry about fighting hardball with hardball. We can't be like them. They are concerned about proposals to reform the Supreme Court. They're concerned about changing filibuster rules. They're concerned about regulating money in politics. They oppose nationalist oligarchy. They want to preserve democracy, but they are fearful that hardball will simply unleash a never-ending tit-for-tat process, permanent escalation. Politics is going to spin out of control. And I want to be clear, we can't rule that out. But that view, which I think you probably recognize as a view held by many of the centrist Democrats that might be holding up the current agenda, it assumes something that I think that we should examine. It says neither side can actually win outright. But that assumption is wrong. Shortly after Lincoln declared, "A house divided against itself cannot stand," he added, "It will become all one thing or all the other." So when you have nationalist oligarchs that are playing hardball time and again to rig the rules so they can never lose power, no matter the outcome, no matter the actual votes that were counted, when they strip our institutions of power after they lose so the other side can't govern, they are playing for keeps. It is not possible to go back in time or return to normalcy as long as one side is playing that way. So when you have these moments of extraordinary politics, you have a transition between eras. And the struggle is not to save the old regime. We make that mistake very often. We try to save the old regime. The struggle is to achieve a new equilibrium. I've spoken before on some of our calls about realignment periods that can have multiple terms, but if you look back in our political history, you have individuals like Jefferson, Jackson, Lincoln, FDR, Reagan. They realigned politics, all right? They consolidated power and they created a new equilibrium from the one that had existed previously. And their heirs, their followers that advanced the banner, and each of those eras eventually collapsed, at which point the cycle starts again. And in the middle of the struggle, many of them were called tyrants at the time. Okay, King Andrew Jackson, again, incredibly problematic figure in US history, depicted as standing on top of the Constitution after his veto on the Bank of the United States. Lincoln was called a despot because he unilaterally suspended habeas corpus, freed the slaves with the Emancipation Proclamation, and blockaded the southern ports. FDR was a dictator because he took bold action during the New Deal. He tried to restructure government to adapt to the challenges of the modern economy that his predecessor, Hoover, wasn't taking seriously. So this is not something brand new, right? These extraordinary political moments have happened before and they have reshaped politics, but they required bold actions, which then ended up setting the foundations for a new era. So you have this struggle between nationalist oligarchy and what I'm calling a redefined democracy. It's a struggle to establish a new equilibrium. And the one side's playing constitutional hardball. They are entrenching minority power. They are supporting policies that redistribute wealth to the rich, new laws that disenfranchise voters, rhetoric and rules that divide people, and they fracture society. And each of those policies reinforces the others. Each of those policies makes it more difficult for the other side, the pro-democracy side, to win. And I want to be very clear about this, and you can probably tell from the passion in my voice, incrementalism and timidity cannot win against that offensive. It will guarantee the death of democracy. But at hardball, in service of building a redefined democracy, has the chance to create a new alternative equilibrium. Hardball that ends up achieving political democracy can break the dam that has held back progress across all these different areas, okay? It can put forward popular policies that build economic democracy, reshapes political power, and reinforces these other aspects, okay? And the result should be greater trust and support in government, not less. Continued popular support for economic democracy as people are lifted up, and a chance to unite our political community like we haven't seen in many, many years. You know, the future is not necessarily this era of permanent escalation that goes on for decades. It's just as likely, in fact, I would argue more likely, that one side will eventually win. It will become all one thing or the other. This goes without saying, but you can't have political change without leadership. You have to have leaders to navigate these reforms through the legislative process, to implement them forcefully, federal, state, local. You need leaders that are going to inspire, to educate, to champion policies. They need to devise strategies. They have to coordinate action. And when you have extraordinary moments like the one we're in, you need leaders with courage and ferocity, a steel spine, bold vision. And if you play this timid incrementalist game, the other side is going to win because they're playing hardball. And what this means is you have to run to win a mandate for change. And not all mandates come with a very specific, they don't all come with the same agenda, right? Roosevelt in 1932 was for change. But the type of change that we needed at the time wasn't entirely obvious because it hadn't been invented yet. He championed, I love this phrasing, bold, persistent experimentation, right? We don't talk about experimentation in policy, but that's what he was proposing. Doing anything in the midst of uncertainty and persistent hopelessness. I bring up these historical examples because they should hopefully ring a bell with the things that we're facing now, right? Leaders need to diagnose the problem and come up with a vision for how to solve them. And if you run on these bold policies, it has the virtue of being able to build popular support. You can educate elites. You can educate the general public about them. And after you win at the polls, it gives you a mandate to implement those policies. And leaders have to continue to sell that vision while they're in power, okay? Mario Cuomo, he was the former governor of New York. I forget the exact years, but he said, politicians campaign in poetry and they govern in prose. And the idea here that he's explaining was that campaigning, you're offering broad, appealing visions to the future, but governing itself is boring and it's detailed. And if that was ever true, which might not be, it's only true in ordinary times. When you have these extraordinary moments, which I think we would all agree that we are in, leaders have to campaign and govern in both poetry and prose. Your campaign has to include details, the prose, to win a mandate for those policies. And when you're governing, you have to establish that new equilibrium. It requires poetry to build popular support for new policies. You know, throughout our history, there have been attempts at transformational change that breaks down because the leaders fail to carry the people with them on that journey. You lose a midterm election, that can prevent a second round of reforms. You lose the presidency, that reverses change altogether. And if you look back at our history, it's striking that the founding presidents of new eras in American politics, they were all followed by a successor of the same party. Van Buren followed Jackson, Truman followed FDR, Bush followed Reagan. In Britain, Major followed Thatcher. That's where we almost were in 2016, not to go back to an unpleasant moment of 8 years of Obama, followed potentially by 4, perhaps 8 years of Clinton, okay? And it shows you the importance of that moment where things could have continued and we could be so much farther along. Repeated victory indicates popular support for a new equilibrium. And what it does, importantly, is it forces the other side to adapt. But repeated victory means you have to win the public while governing. Poetry plus prose. Going back to playing hardball, it's not easily done without popular energy. And if you want to achieve a redefined democracy, it is going to require the people, us, all of you, right, to organize, to mobilize, to, forgive me, spread the gospel of democracy. It's because the system, this slide's a little different. It's the only one where I'm using all caps. It's the only one where I'm highlighting something in the text here. The system will not produce change on its own. Why would it? Okay, over and over again, political scientists have shown that politics works to support the preferences of wealthy and powerful individuals and corporations. And if the system is fundamentally rigged to favor those groups, why would you expect the system itself to go along with changes that undermine that system's power, that undermine the very leveraged status quo, okay? So how does progress happen? Historically, some of the most transformative moments have coincided with war or crises, situations in which the ordinary rules of politics go the heck out the window. But progress has also been possible when there is overwhelming, unrelenting popular pressure. If you go back to the turn of the 20th century, populists and progressives pushed forward a variety of extraordinary changes: the minimum wage, maximum working hours, campaign finance reforms, constitutional amendments. Good Lord, when's the last time we talked about the possibility of a constitutional amendment, right? Income taxes, antitrust laws. These changes came in part because there was popular demand all across the country that politicians, and importantly, the people, were demanding them. People went on strike, they organized, and you're damn sure they voted, okay? And during the 60s, the civil rights movement put pressure on leaders to end Jim Crow segregation in the South. And it is because popular pressure is critical for transformational, lower D democratic change. And we are seeing signs of this change happening right now. You know, just go back to the Trump era, millions of women marching in cities. Go back to 2017, the Affordable Care Act was on the chopping block, the infamous thumbs down, right? But before that moment, people were packing town hall meetings to tell their members of Congress how freaking important healthcare was for them and their families, all right? That happened because of people. And there are many, many more people right now running for office for the first time, including local offices. Hi, Lisa. And in the process, they are bringing new voters into the political process, okay? None of this that I'm describing offers a guarantee that we're going to win, but sustained popular mobilization is a requisite for success. Popular pressure can also push leaders away from the timidity that I was talking about, and it can push them towards transformative solutions. We've seen this happening. To give recent examples, you have Democratic socialists like Bernie Sanders, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. They have had an indelible impact on the Democratic Party already, whether you vote for them or support their ideas or not. They mobilized people to support ideas like the Green New Deal, Medicare for all, and they end up bringing new voters into the political system and the process. And they have moved the center of gravity within American politics away from incrementalism to talking about bigger thinking. Again, even if you disagree with those specifics, people who oppose nationalist oligarchy should look at individuals like that, or also the grassroots individuals that they're bringing into the process, as an irritant and an opportunity. Okay, they end up opening up policy possibilities that otherwise would not exist. All right, last section here. I know I'm going long. People tend to think of what is politically possible as static, okay? They believe what is viable is the same today as it will be tomorrow and as it was yesterday, but that is wrong. Actions today can reshape the political context. They can open up possibilities not previously available. The idea of significant regulation in the financial sector was virtually unthinkable before the financial crash back in, what, 08, 09. And after the crash, it was inevitable. If you want to achieve a redefined democracy, it is going to require sequencing policies with an understanding that politics is not static. Policy victories today unlock policy options tomorrow. You know, if you go back to neoliberals waging war on unions, that eroded the central countervailing power against corporations. And as unions became less powerful over time, they couldn't fight back as hard. And as a result, deregulation became increasingly possible. They also cut taxes, knowing that in doing so, that would put pressure on government budgets. So then you end up getting sharp reductions in taxes that give further power to their argument that balanced budgets require cutting spending. So the key to using policy for building power is to push first for policies that build power and popular support, not ones that sap power and popular support. And that might sound simple, but policies can be extremely important. They can be extremely urgent. But if pursuing them first undermines popular support, those policies can threaten to derail the rest of your agenda that is needed for democracy right here, right now, in this moment. And the argument here is that those policies should only be pursued in a genuine crisis. And even then, you need to counterbalance them with power building actions. So, and I've already given it away here in the slide, but the first step in winning this battle for democracy is an anti-corruption, pro-political democracy agenda. Victory on that agenda opens the possibilities. Remember I said you're trying to unlock all these things that work in concert together, okay? It opens the possibility of reform and progress in all the other sectors. If you care about healthcare, if you care about climate change or anything else, you have to unrig the system first. If you weaken the power of lobbyists, if you weaken the power of corporations and wealthy individuals to determine policy, that will mean that all policies will be less likely to serve their interests, including the things that are highly salient for you. And the first step, this one that I'm talking about right here, anti-corruption, pro-democracy agenda, that is hugely popular. According to one poll, 70% of Americans think that one of the greatest threats to America is corruption in our political system. People do want, across the ideological divide, a more representative government. And the second step, which is absolutely imperative, is you have to show people that in this unrigged system, that government can and will work for them. And this is where portions of the economic democracy agenda, infrastructure, internet for all, curbing drug prices, this is where all of these things come into play, right? Immediately tangible benefits to individuals, families, communities. And leaders and movements should attempt to make these changes in ways that reshape economic power. You combine these household policies with structural reforms like it's not the sexiest thing, but reinvigorating antitrust, coming up with geographically minded industrial policies. Okay, those are reforms that don't get a lot of play in our media, but they would change the structure of our economy. They would help us achieve economic democracy, but in the process, they would further reduce the power of the wealthy and big corporations to shape politics. And the result of all of that is a virtuous cycle that can achieve a great democracy. This slide not sponsored by Virtuous Cycles in Lafayette. I just want to end with this. Frederick Douglass said back in 1857, the whole history of the progress of human liberty shows that all concessions have been born of earnest struggle. If there is no struggle, there is no process. There is no progress, sorry. The reason that progress requires struggle, moral struggle, physical struggle, all-encompassing struggle is simple. Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did, and it never will, end quote. What we're engulfed in now is going to contain, has contained, will continue to contain struggle. It's hard. What I laid out today in trying to define the problem and work through not only what an idealized version of democracy is, but how we get there, it's all really hard. But we have the ability to win that battle if we can link together those solutions. I truly believe. So I've taken more time than I wanted to. I want to open things up for questions here.
Can't hear you, Trey. Nope.
I can't hear Trey.
Can I just ask a question? Is someone asking a question?
Can you hear me now?
Go ahead.
Hi, Trey.
Yes, we got you, Trey.
Went out again.
You can type it in if you want, Trey. All right, this is like at the end of class. I either everyone lost interest or I just explained it so well that there are no questions.
Oh, I have a question.
Yeah.
So Andy, what are the three things we should be doing as Indivisible or as citizens? What should I be thinking about every day when I get up?
Well, if you go back to the grassroots slide, I think part of that for Indivisible is identifying, you remember the description that I gave of leaders, is identifying those people at every level as best we can, right? For example, just within Indiana, conceding the state at really any elected office to one party, just basically saying that this state is going to have one party rule, is is a losing proposition, right? That is fewer votes in the Senate, that's fewer votes in the House of Representatives, but it's also fewer votes at the state level. And the reason I tried, I gave a lot of American examples, but this was written about lower D democracy more broadly. You could apply this to other countries that are struggling with authoritarian rule and crumbling norms and institutions, but you can also apply that to the state of Indiana or Lafayette or Delphi or Rossville, you know what I mean? Like, you can apply that to all of these places in terms of the types of reforms that are needed, not specifically like, Senate Bill 1, John Lewis Voting Rights Act, et cetera, but I think that the problems that exist in the micro are representative of problems that exist in the macro. And it is, the economic problems, the economic inequality that we see in Lafayette is the same as it is in Lafayette, Louisiana, I would bet, right? So I think that we are working on many of the right things. Go ahead, Trey.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Oh, excellent.
Until you start asking the question.
I'm sorry too. If you weren't quite done, I was still messing with my microphone. Um, so I wanted to thank you for that, and it was it was inspiring. Um, my question though is about your last slide. Those 2 points, your step 1 and step 2, the last 2 points on the slide. Um, um, yeah, thank you. You said that the first step is anti-corruption, pro-political democracy agenda. Um, and the second step is to show people that that unrigged system can work for them. So my concern is that it's a sort of a twofold concern. One, if people aren't convinced that unrigging the system will work for them first, then will they support the anti-corruption agenda? I know that things like surveys, I've seen similar surveys to the ones you were talking about that say, 70+% of people support reducing corruption. And I don't know how that question is phrased, but it almost seems like a leading question. Would you support reducing corruption? Well, of course I would. But are people going to get behind it if they don't see short-term benefits? And if they do support it first and then don't see immediate benefits to themselves, will they continue to help you build a coalition? You see what I mean? Because I'm concerned that getting rid of corruption.
It's a great question, and I would posit this: outside of local elections, in rare instances, how many campaigns have you seen, especially at the national level, even say Senate candidates, have put anti-corruption first and foremost for their agenda, have put that front and center? I would argue little to none. The fact is, if you put this as the 8th plank of your 22 plank agenda on your website and don't talk about it and don't reinforce it, you see this as times where you're trying to extricate an individual that is corrupt. If you are running against someone who is under ethics investigation in the House of Representatives, for example, and you run against that person, you say, I'm going to clean up, Washington. But what you don't see is a slate of anti-corruption legislation and hammer it and hammer it and hammer it. I would say that the closest that we came to that in recent times would be maybe Elizabeth Warren's 2020 run, maybe Bernie Sanders, but this is also part of a much larger discussion on economic inequality, which is great, but you don't have people making this front and center part of their agenda, again, except in very rare cases where you're running against, the worst of the worst.
Right. Well, I'd be concerned that if we were to magically sort of root out corruption, it would bring positive change, but that positive change would be very slow coming. And the people who were being rooted out of office would make sure and do damage on their way out that might reduce the power of your message, right? You know what I'm saying?
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. I think that even with that, we talked about how we're trying to create this virtuous cycle. I think that I think that just because you have bad actors that are willing to be a bull in a china shop on the way out, I don't think that lessens its import, right? Just because it's hard doesn't mean we shouldn't do it. Just because you have bad actors, that's like, saying, well, if we don't play hardball on this issue, then they'll go easy on us, right? Which we've learned is just not meeting the moment.
No. And I absolutely agree that anti-corruption is vitally important. I just worry that there might be lower hanging fruit, but I don't know. The more I talk about this, it is so important.
Restoring trust in institutions is something that will have the benefit of actually making those institutions operate more effectively if you're getting bad apples out. But it will also increase people's understanding of the import of our political systems and voting, right? If you want more people to vote, but you consistently tell them that government is bad, it doesn't do anything right, why would you show up to vote?
Right.
So we're trying to create this cycle where they're all working together. Matt.
Yeah.
We're out of time,
no, I wasn't going to say anything about time. I was just like, Not really like well, I mean, it's a comment slash question sort of thing. And want to say, like, you brought up a lot of good points, especially about how like economic inequality, which by the way, it's worse than it's ever been in American history right now. Like robber barons, worse than that. It's out of control. But like when we're talking about like anti-corruption and like antitrust and stuff like that, right now we have two political parties that I would argue that are captured by large donors, big money. Two of the same, they still answer to the same people. One of them answers to a lot more right-wing nationalism stuff, but they both still talk to donors. So when we talk about electing people on a slate of doing things like pro-democracy, they have incentives, both of them, to not have that happen. I think that we're seeing that play out right now. We have two people, but I think that there's more. They're just the ones taking the brunt of it, who are standing in the way of passing real reforms for putting more pro-democracy stuff on the laws. And so question or think about, what do we do about that? Because there's so many people who are like, oh, we can't primary anybody. Nancy Pelosi's good, we should keep her in there. Like all of these things that are like in the way of any of this stuff happening. And I don't know how many times in my lifetime I'm going to hear we just need to elect more Democrats for us to have the same thing that's happening right now. And I don't give any crap about Joe Manchin or how he's in West Virginia. That is just, it's conceding the point before we do it.
Competition is good, right? Choices, having a slate of choices is inherently a good thing. And it eliminates some of the problems that we have with entrenched political interests, individuals that are dedicated to playing this infinite game. And if the goal here, which I hope came through, is transformation, and that is what the moment calls for and has honestly called for some time, not just with the emergence of a particular demagogue in 2016, then I think you have to ask yourself, who is more likely to bring about the transformative change that the moment calls for? And in some cases, old dogs can learn new tricks and they understand and meet the moment. In many cases, that is not the case because they are entrenched. Not to say that they're bad or they're not fighting for the right things, but on this issue, we need people who are consistently right. So that's just my 2 cents, Matt.
Yeah, no, I agree. I seem frustrated because I am. And if you want to see somebody else who's frustrated, go follow Ezra's Twitter feed recently. He's been a lot more fiery than he normally is. He's a lot more cool and collected because, well, of all of this.
Yeah, it's a call to make this a front and center issue for the administration, not behind closed doors, but to say the loud part out loud about what is happening. And I understand, as someone who's studied politics for a long time, I understand the strategy and the strategies that different people are utilizing, but I think that he's calling out the game, and his frustration is our frustration, Matt. And I think probably shared by a lot of folks. Not to say that other good things aren't happening, but I was talking about trying to sequence policy wins and events and how success begets success. The bottom line is you got to win, win, win. You got to win and win. And I went back to the sad example of 2016, but not to say that we would have still met the moment, but we wouldn't have taken as many steps backward, obviously, right? And it would have forced more of a reckoning than the other party. It would have. Doesn't mean that you wouldn't have a Trump clone running in 2020, 2024, but losing forces you to change your approach. So
I think a good, you mentioned it, just, I don't mean to hog the conversation. You mentioned like material benefits. I think that's super important of like providing tangible benefits to people, and actually like governing is different than winning elections. That's different politics and actually governing. Like the earned income tax credit, which the Democrats have been running on for literally my whole life. it's great and it helps people. And also people aren't outside holding up signs saying like, sweet, earned income tax credits. When my taxes are done, I get something back. Like it's so obscured from like what actually helps people, even if it does. But like having something like the stuff from coronavirus, the actual stimulus checks, like you got that in the mail. Like that's something that you have.
The extra money that families and individuals are going to get for kids, I believe, starting this month.
Yeah.
I think it's $300. That's a tangible benefit. That's a tangible benefit that you will feel. Go back to the Obama administration. I believe that they worked in like, okay, we're going to give people money, but it's kind of going to be something that they did what was economically the right thing to do, but people didn't know it was there. And I think that's just a lesson that you learn over time, right? There is politics involved and people need to know that they're receiving a benefit and who gave it to them. And I think that one thing that can and should be emphasized even more with what you talked about with the economic relief that went out is those checks weren't possible unless we win Warnock and Ossoff. Thank you for letting me push this till after the school year ended, because I'm sure it would have been a very different presentation than with a much more beleaguered Andy. So.
Thank you, Andy.
Yeah, thanks, Andy.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Andy. Bye, everyone.